Swayam Bagaria is an assistant professor of Hindu studies at Harvard Divinity School. He holds a PhD in anthropology from Johns Hopkins University. His research interests on religion span from cognitive science to technology and psychedelics-induced religious experience. Swayam, welcome.
Thank you, William. Glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your background. How did you become interested in religion?
Sure. So I was born and brought up in India, which is a highly religious country, but I was never quite religious myself, even though I come from a family which is very much inclined in that direction. I came here when I was 18 years old for college. By here, I mean by America. And I was studying math. I had a very set sort of plan for my future. I was going to do a PhD in mathematical logic, and then that's the path that I would sort of take as my professional sort of career. But then for some reason or the other, like there were a few serendipitous things that happened. My eventual PhD advisor was visiting my college, and I became really impressed by her. It just happened to be the case that she was in anthropology. So when I applied to graduate school, I ended up working with her at Johns Hopkins University. For the duration of my PhD program, I was mostly interested in anthropology or in religion as an anthropological object. For me, there was something really intriguing about this thing called religion, which in my head was the most decentralized way of norm compliance with the most like minimal amount of transaction costs. So if you wanted to create cooperative communities with minimal oversight, that's how I thought of religion per se, both historically as well as anthropologically. And how did that persist in our contemporary world?
Let me see if I make sure I understand what you're saying. When you say decentralized, you say decentralized in social authority or decentralized as an individual? What do you mean by that?
Decentralized in the sense that you don't need like a constant threat of force for people to comply with it. So it was a highly sort of internalized way of norm compliance that did not require like a police force all the time monitoring you, or that did not require something akin to regulatory authority who would constantly be on the lookout for whether you are being religious or not. So in some sense, and this is an argument that you can see in evolutionary anthropology, which is that if you want to build cooperative societies at scale, then religion is a pretty good model to be able to do that. So for me, what was very interesting was in my PhD years, I found Hinduism to be a very good way of doing this while also maintaining a lot of internal difference and variety within it. So that was my PhD program, and I ended up working on Hinduism, but from a very anthropological angle. And then when I got this job at Harvard, I became very interested in how archives of religion can productively add to conversations about the philosophy of mind and psychotherapy today. So that's when I started working on yoga. And yoga is just a word which is sort of like a cluster of mind-body practices in Hinduism, as opposed to what we think of yoga, right? Like in today's world. I became interested in psychedelics, and a lot of my work has now shifted to trying to extract what I think is relevant about religion for our contemporary world.
It's funny that you talk about the diversity of Hinduism. That's one of the things that fascinates me about it. And an Indian I once spoke to corrected me when I talked about Hinduism as a religion. He said it was religions plural. Do you agree?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I do think it is religions in that it is plural. There is a one sort of like an easy way of thinking about the distinctiveness of Hinduism, in which you can think of Hindus as not being believers but seekers.
Mm,
And as insofar as you're a seeker, whatever path works for you is something that is as fine as every other path that has been outlined in the history of Hinduism. So, in this view of things, deities basically become not like ontological entities. So when people think of Hinduism, they think of like 30 million gods and goddesses. And, the immediate question is, do they all exist or not? And if you start from the axiom that I mentioned about Hindus being seekers, then a deity is just a kind of concentrative object which allows you to realize yourself as a seeker.
mm,
And insofar as, there is variety in culture, there is a variability in geography and regions, you have that many deities because people found them to be like apparatuses of sorts for them to be able to concentrate their mind in
mhm,
a
mhm,
contemplative direction. But I also think it is not religions, and it is a religion because I think Hinduism is the one religion that really tried to articulate or in some ways micromanage every aspect of your life. So they had a metaphysical vision, and then from every little detail, like sartorial details, the way in which you walk, the way in which you look at people, the way in which you can talk to people and greet them, everything was considered to be an element worth micromanaging to realize that metaphysical vision in our social world.
mm,
So that's how you get like the really, really stringent, like jurisprudential structures of Hinduism, what we think of as caste these days. That's how you basically get to the fact that even right now in India, um, like intercaste marriage is non-existent. Like it is a very minor proportion of it, because the family becomes the unit of organizing social life, and everything about the way in which a family is constructed was considered to be like fodder for thinking about how metaphysics is realized in your day-to-day life. So I do think it is a religion in that sense, in which even though there might be distinct paths, they all share this vision of concretizing a metaphysics in your day-to-day life that is very, very micromanaging. And there is this sort of quote that I always think of when I think of the distinctiveness of Hinduism, which comes from Ramdas, and I'm assuming sort of you would know who Ramdas is. And he said that, well, Buddhism is basically Hinduism for export, because Hinduism is too tied to the soil. It's too tied to the specific locale
mhm,
within which that practice arose. So for
mhm,
me, the answer is like both ways in some ways. Yeah.
mhm, mhm. Well, here's one other thing I'm curious about. Hinduism, as you say, has many practices, many paths. You can take a path of meditation, and I'm a Zen Buddhist, so I guess I would be in a Hindu situation, a sort of a Raja
Hmm.
practitioner. There's also devotion, there's selfless action, there's wisdom. So I guess I wonder, how do people find their paths? Can they take more than one at one time? Is it sort of prescribed for them, or is it a matter of choice? How does it work in everyday life?
Yeah. So the way in which I think about the choice of the path that you take is essentially there is one path that is considered to be natural for everybody, which is the one that your ancestors followed. And
Mm,
by ancestors, I meant your specific, like really your familial ancestors, right? So that is considered to be like the default option in some way. And then everything that you do after uh, is made recognizable for the people around you by thinking of like different paths that exist that they might be familiar with. So let's say tomorrow I decide to become an ascetic. Um, they will not see my choices as being uh, as just a product of like individual decisions that I have made. They will not think of it as a purely personal act. They will think of an archetype. that exists in Hinduism that they could use or employ to make sense of what I've done. So maybe in the American style of things, I have just essentially made decisions based on my life experience. But from the Hindu angle of things, I have become something like a different archetype that they have heard stories about or that they know about. So there is choice in life, but there is a default option. And often the choices that you make take you away from that default option or they keep you within it. So that's how I think about both the rigidity in some ways of Hinduism, but also how they make sense of people who deviate from
Mm.
this kind of rigidity. So as you mentioned, there are there are people think of schemas. So in the Bhagavad Gita, there are like four paths, as you said. There is a karma yoga, which is the path of action. There is the path of devotion. There is the path of knowledge, and then there is the path of meditation. Um, the reason why those four particular paths were articulated was because they coincided with a social category who would embody that path to its most highest ideal. So if I think of the path of action, it would be like the ruler, the king. They could not become an ascetic. Their kingdom will crumble. People rely on them for their welfare. So for them, like if I have to think of karma yoga, which is the path of action, they thought of karma yoga as a way to make sense of what the ruler was supposed to do. If I think of the devotee part, the bhakti yoga part, they thought of it as the most ideal way in which you can make sense of what a householder does. So a householder cannot, sort of pursue a path of knowledge in the same way an intellectual does. And the
Mhm.
householder cannot retire from society and become an ascetic like the way that Raja Yoga will prescribe. So then what do you do? So you basically, the four parts of that were outlined in the Bhagavad Gita was about what is most natural to you. So emotion is most natural to the householder. Action is most natural to the ruler. A certain kind of stringent asceticism is most natural to the Raja Yoga practitioner, and the intellect is most natural to some other class of intellectuals. And you pick the thing that comes most natural to you, and you use it as a mechanism to realize the divine. So that is how you find this plurality in Hinduism in some ways.
I'm also interested in the intersection with institutions. When we think of religion in Western society, we're probably thinking of um, a church, a synagogue, and going there and there being a sort of an institution behind the religion. Uh, What sort of institutions do you have in Hinduism, or how is that structured?
Yeah, the way in which I think of the institutional scaffolding of Hinduism is that there is no organizational way of thinking about institutions in Hinduism. So I can't find like a temple or a set of temples or a cluster of religious authorities who will be recognized as such, like all across different denominations of Hinduism. I don't think that exists. Um, but I do think that there is a lot of institutional memory. And the institutional memory does not have so much to do with organizations, but it has to do with social units. So, for example, because the family is the unit of organizing social life in Hinduism, a lot of what you consider to be institutions will have to do with the way in which the family considers itself to be a part of a set of ancestral connections that it is supposed to continue. So institutions are like in some ways um, they are you do they are different from organizations that we
Mm.
often think of as prescribing a set of rules or like giving the annual sort of like a memo to all the devotees to be like, hey, this is what you're supposed to be doing. I think in Hinduism it's a lot more tacit knowledge. Nobody is giving out these instructions, and that tacit knowledge is often sort of the way in which families ensure their continuity,
Hmm.
both to their in terms of their own ancestors, but also in terms of their future progenitors. So I stopped there just to see if this makes sense or not, William.
It does,
Yeah.
and perhaps you can correct me if I have a misconception, but I guess I imagine the teachers from the Hindu tradition as being more sort of freelancers, if you will. Do you think that's accurate?
A little bit, yes, because in the sense that like most of the people who you see in the contemporary world who claim to be Hindu teachers, they want to make claims for something which is a lot more larger than their own, like caste identity or personal identity, right? They want more followers. They want to like speak to people who across these kinds of social lines of division.
Hmm.
Uh, and the way in which they usually do it is, I think, rather than telling people you have to erase your own sense of ancestrality, they find a way of incorporating it as a part of their own sort of like outreach to them.
Hmm.
So you can almost think of Hinduism as this very vast conglomerate of practices, lineages, beliefs that expand by negating nothing. There was, it's so for like, there's a term that scholars used to use, which I don't completely agree with, but they called it essentially neo-Hinduism. And the way in which they thought Hinduism worked was, well, I'm going to learn from you, but I'm not going to negate anything that I believe myself. So the expansion is actually multiplication of connections as
Hmm.
opposed to like continuous relearning of priors that we often think of learning as.
There seems to be some paradoxes here. It feels like there's a great amount of restriction of action and thought and a great amount of freedom of action and thought. It seems like it's the oldest religion, the oldest major religion we have, but at the same time, to me, it feels jarringly potentially modern. This multimodality, this diversity. What do you think about that take?
No, I completely agree. And I think that's what people haven't been able to sort of reckon with in
Mm.
some ways in Hinduism. There's a saying for India that I think applies to Hinduism as well, which is in India, everything is true and its opposite is true. Uh, and I think that's the case for Hinduism as well. Like in some ways, one of the lines in the Mahabharata, which is one of the biggest epics in the world, but also a really important epic for Hinduism, is everything that has happened in the world is contained here. If it is not contained here, it has not happened in the world. Right. So I do find this dual sort of almost like holographically sort of mirroring quality to Hinduism in which um there is no way of being absolutely new because they will say that we have anticipated this in some way in our own sort of mythological universe.
Mhm.
And then there is no way in which you can break from the old because there is everything that was worth taking place in this universe has already taken place in the past. Right. So there is this quality in which it is traditional and it is highly constrained. Uh, and it is highly, highly modern in the sense that you can almost see it providing an endless array of choices to people while while having other people around you be able to make immediate sense of it because they can relate it to an archetype from the past. So I think there's this kind of like
Fascinating.
sort of dual
Um,
quality to Hinduism.
one of your research interests is the intersection of mental health and well-being programs of religion. And one of the things I'm struck by are the studies that show how religious orientation positively influences mental health indicators and social indicators. But in our culture, the therapeutic and the religion and the religious are in completely different silos. How do you see their relationship or the potential relationship?
Yeah, and this is a lot of what my current work is about, which is both working on the more secular side of things. So, like the secular side of things when it comes to mental health is like they are preoccupied with questions about, well, in a country like India, which is highly under-resourced, in which the number of psychiatrists are really very, very small. How do you scale up services? How do you essentially create delivery systems that will meet the needs of this widespread demand of mental health, while also acknowledging that, you can't just scale up the supply overnight. So that's what they're concerned with. Uh, a lot of what they like, sort of, these are clinical psychologists, public health researchers, psychiatrists. A lot of what they're concerned, I think their main preoccupation is that there are certain things that have been worked out in the Western academy as being evidence based, and we just rely on that. And then we scale those specific practices up, like CBT or what have you, for the case of India. Uh, However, I do think that mental health is so that's let me put it this way. That's one way of doing mental health in a place like India. Um, there's another way in which one can think of like a slightly more incrementally sort of progressive direction by which mental health incorporates the religious aspect of people's behavior. It is that if you're a psychotherapist working in India, you can't ignore the fact that your patient is probably very religious, and they will bring religion into the conversation uh, pretty immediately, like on the first meeting that they have with you. So, as a psychotherapist, I think the question then should emerge is that do I just ignore it?
Mm,
Or in some ways, incorporating it will make me be able to address the mental health needs of my patients better.
right.
So that's where I think you have a slightly more different idea of mental health that tries to incorporate like cultural competencies and religious competencies into the training program of these practitioners. You see a lot of that here in America, but I think, there are sort of incipient projects that are trying to scale this up for India as well and for other parts of the world. And then there's the third aspect of mental health and religion in India, which I think is you create a psychotherapeutic practice based on the principles of the contemplative tradition called Hinduism.
Mhm.
So, in like in India, you will find like a ragtag of like different mental health providers, from Ayurvedic practitioners to people who sort of try to build psychotherapeutic models based on yoga, to thinking about how meditation can help you sort of think about cognition differently or emotional processing differently than the ways in which you usually find here. And a lot of my work is it's like sort of split across these three domains. I don't think these three are easily reconcilable. Often the experts don't talk to each other in these fields. Um, but I think that's more like a problem of the academy rather than a problem of the fact that, well, mental health, for creating any mental health system in India, you need to acknowledge the pervasive presence of religion in people's lives. And the way in which you do it then differs.
I was surprised when you said that, or maybe I misunderstand you, that this is quite developed in the United States, this combination of spirituality and psychotherapy. On which side? On the therapeutic side, or is it the religious practitioners gaining competency in the therapeutic side?
Yeah, I think it's on the research side of things. I don't think
I
it
see.
has sort of been transmitted yet to the therapeutic
Mhm.
side, but I know of several social work faculty researchers, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists who have been experimenting with these training models in which they make the psychotherapist a little bit more aware of their own biases when it comes to their religious background or their religious like tacit assumptions that they bring to the table, as well as acknowledging what the patient's background might be. And I think it is still very much on the research side of things. I think there's a lot of sort of new work and new models there. On the psychotherapeutic side, it's hard because, in some ways, even getting the psychiatrist, because they're already so overburdened with the stuff that they're supposed to do with the patient, getting them to do like a 5-minute interview about the patient's spiritual background is actually a big commitment for them.
Yeah.
And and I think that's the next piece of the puzzle, which is how do you translate all of this research into actual practice?
Mm.
And I think that will be hard. But for me, in a place like India, it is unavoidable. That's, and this is where like the different trajectories of secularization in India and America really matter.
Mm.
Like a colleague of mine who was giving this workshop at one of the biggest psychiatric outpatient units in India at AIMS Delhi. In this workshop, he basically mentioned one factoid, which is just that in America, there are large-scale epidemiological studies that basically shows that there is some association between religious coping and different kinds of disorder. And a lot of those associations tend to be some positive, right? Uh, for the people, for the residents who were in the workshop, this came as a huge sigh of relief because they're like, we hear this all the time with our patients. Our
Mm.
training basically tells us avoid them, ignore it. Don't try to incorporate it. You're only gonna encourage superstition or encourage ways of coping that are unhealthy. uh, but seeing this factoid and seeing the high quality of this research, it gives us some reassurance that, we are actually here listening to our patients when
Yeah.
they are stating their preferences and not ignoring them. And I think that's the difference. In India, you can't avoid it. In America, there has to be a little bit more effort in how to create more translational mechanisms for this research to sort of, go into the practice itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, you also teach a course at Harvard called Spirituality and Technology. We have seen instances where neurosurgeons operating to treat seizures have stimulated parts of the brain and caused experiences that were described as spiritual.
Mhm.
Is it possible that one day we will have a computer brain interface installed and then maybe once a week we can press a God button and have a religious experience?
I think that's what people would really like to have, like have spiritual experiences on demand in some sort of way. And the course is about that. The course is basically about because with the rapid rise in the ways like in brain technologies of scanning, in the ways in which we can collect information about people's sort of altered states of consciousness, there is this confluence in which somehow spiritual experiences that were considered to be impossible, like a few decades back, are now considered to be like that people can find signatures, the brain signatures, phenomenological descriptions, uh, etc., for validating these experiences.
Mm.
You have labs in Barcelona basically trying, sort of providing out of body experiences to people on demand. Uh, you have, of course, psychedelics and the way in which they're supposed to induce mystical experience, like to literally to anybody. You don't have to have any contemplative practice or some history of actually creating these altered states uh, in an incremental fashion. You can pop a pill and, you can have that similarly, ego dissolving experience that you often find in meditation. And I think so the class is about that. The class, and we pick up a bunch of case studies that sort of relate to this problem, and we consider a few sort of conceptual frameworks that help us analyze these case studies. Predominantly William James's peak experience framework, um, he was the founder of American psychology, and his book Varieties of Religious Experience is considered to be a classic even right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he had uh, he had this experience of consuming nitrous oxide, and then essentially it became the first essay written by a modern day psychologist who was in the academy on psychedelics
Mm-hmm.
in America. And so we do William James's conceptual framework, but a lot of the course material is essentially uh, giving people some familiarity with this very weird like world, I'd say, of engineered spirituality, and then sort of bringing up questions about, are these spiritual in the same way in which the same experiences but that were not technologically triggered but that were pedagogically learned, like, are these the same thing?
Mm-hmm.
Is what is happening in your brain uh, enough of a sign that you are having the same experience that somebody who probably put in a lot of cumulative effort in their lives to realize this experience are having?
Mm.
So we do meditation, we do psychedelics, we do virtual reality, we do grief with AI chatbots, a lot of, yeah,
Well,
weird things.
it's it's interesting to me that the spiritual experience could be uh, triggered by electrical stimulation or psychedelics, and it feels to me that that is inconvenient for the atheist scientists that believe that religion is a spandrel or a sort of secondary effect. But it's also
Yeah.
inconvenient for the believers too, right? Who say that it's all caused by God. So it feels like it's
Yeah, it's
problematic for both sides, isn't it?
yeah. I think this kind of work pisses off all kinds of people. It pisses off the believers because they think that this is some kind of hipsterism, essentially that has been given intellectual facade, like an intellectual facade. It is definitely pissing off for a lot of the people who are atheists and like a little bit like sort of don't consider religion to be a good thing at all. They consider it to be misdirection in our evolutionary history, and as you said, a spandrel, sort of almost. And for them, they might not believe, or they might not agree with the normative part of religion per se, but they have a hard time denying the fact that there is some reality to a spiritual experience, or what has been called spiritual experience. Maybe they don't call it spiritual; they will call it altered states.
Hmm.
And I think
Hmm.
that somehow alleviates the anxiety
Hmm.
that this is not something that is completely out of scope of our brain.
Hmm.
Like if you are able to find sort of veridical proofs of our brain acting in specific ways to create this experience, then that is purely within the provenance of science. Uh, and then labeling it becomes a contentious issue. So they might be like, this is not spiritual. This is just your brain realizing a latent potential, for
Hmm.
example.
Hmm.
And I think that's where the interesting sort of, stuff lies. Like what is called spiritual? Uh, does it have to have a scaffolding belief to it? Which is like, do you need something like a cosmology or a metaphysics for you to be able to see this experience in its fullest sense? Or can you, get rid of it and be like, this is just a subliminal part of my brain that I had not realized existed, now becoming existent, like now becoming active in some ways.
Hmm. I'm also wondering how this washes at Harvard Divinity School. Are most of the students there going with an interest in the neuroscience and anthropology of religion? Are they interested to be practitioners? And if they are interested in being practitioners of religion, are they pissed off, like you say, or are they nourished by that sort of
Yeah,
discourse?
this is the first time I'm teaching that class this fall, and it's been an interesting experience. And I think there are two reasons. One is what you mentioned, William, which is that Uh, People don't expect this kind of a class to be offered at the Divinity School because a lot of the classes are tradition specific,
Mhm.
right? Even if they are comparative, they're not sort of comparative in this particular sense. They're comparative in the sense that you look at an idea and then you look at different histories of different religions and how they have addressed that particular idea. So, to those students who are expecting that, uh, I think there's an easy way to convince them to sort of like convince them of the importance of this kind of an approach that I take in my class is that, there's a lot of people in America that are spiritual but not religious. And, and it's increasing exponentially. How do you account for their life, for the way in which they create their hybrid metaphysics, for the way in which they seek experiences? To understand them, you will need to understand this specific idea of spirituality that I'm trying to teach as part of this course. The second one is the ethics of it, because, and I think that's where I also find like a little bit more of a l- like I have to explain or I have defend my sort of zone to people at Harvard Divinity School because they often associate this kind of things like psychedelics, brain hacking, meditation, VR, AI with Silicon Valley, and they think that this is just some uh, sub community of very rich people who are bored with their lives trying to create some kind of excitement for
Mm.
themselves. Um, and the way in which I try to sort of get around that particular objection is that I mostly concentrate on the research. So if you look at the psychedelic researchers at Johns Hopkins or UCSF or Harvard, uh, in some ways, intellectually, you should be able to disconnect what is it that they are doing from the ways in which this kind of research leads to creation of like subcommunities in the larger world. Same with meditation, same with AI and grief pots. And so for me, I think that objection is a lot more pervasive. And I do think that the ethics of this is complicated.
Mm.
I don't think there's a simple, straightforward answer to it, even though people might really want it. There, so I think it's a new course. I'll see how it is received, and then go from there to see if I want to reteach it or not.
Okay, it sounds fascinating. I would certainly
Yeah.
take the course. Here's a last question, and perhaps you can take it to a more personal place, like where where you live in terms of your relationship with the world. I'm feeling kind of buffeted on one side by this neuroscience, where last 80 years, neurosurgeons have been stimulating neurons and getting movement. People are hearing Beethoven symphonies. People are getting religious experiences. People are getting all sorts of things are happening. And then
Mm-hmm.
on the other side, in the last 5 years of computer science, these AI models are creating things that undoubtedly you would consider creative if they came from a human being. You're seeing people, sane people, calling AIs their best friend, their lover.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're seeing cognitive results, passing the bar test, many impressive results there. And it all seems to be pushing towards a physicalist explanation of the mind. And I'm wondering if our minds are just very fancy machines. Do you think that makes human life a little less special, a little less sacred?
I do think that it makes cognition a little less special. Um, I don't think it makes our own sense of ourselves less special. So let me sort of say a few things in response to what you just said. And by the way, these are all like thoughts in the making. The
Mhm.
world is changing way too quickly for me to have any kind of like strong opinion on it. Uh, I uh, I do think that So if I have to, let's say, go back to reconnect it to Hinduism, to go back to the Yoga Sutra, which is the main text of, or considered to be the main classical text related to yoga. In the Yoga Sutra, they have a model of like of mind and matter that is somewhat coincident with what you see in Western philosophy, but a little bit different from it. So in Western philosophy, like you have like physical stuff and then you have mental stuff, which is like Descartes' elementary distinction. And then, essentially you have like cogitations, and then you have your physical matter, and then there are two different sources, uh, ontological sources for these two different things. In the Yoga Sutra, the matter occupies more of what we consider to be a part of the mind in Western philosophy. So, in the Yoga Sutra, your cognitions, your sense of I-ness, your rationality, your intelligence, they're all considered to be a part, or in some ways, like an epiphenomena of matter. What you are is something different from the way in which your mind, or the rational basis, or the rational instruments of your mind. You are, again, they will call it awareness, they will call it all kinds of other things, but they don't consider you to have a sense of uniqueness because of the way in which you think. The way in which you think is important, uh, but the way in which you think is only important insofar as it makes you realize that you are a lot more than what you think. Uh, this is something that you even see, for example, in 50s, 60s, 70s in Silicon Valley, where when things like cybernetics, etc., which tended to, or even like behavioral psychology, which tended to essentially make every action or emotion or decision that you take as being pre-programmable in some way, as being explicable by some interaction between your own brain and your environment. The thing that they turn to compensate for that is that, well, if I start thinking of myself as a machine, then am I just that or am I something else? And a lot of them then retreated to a certain kind of like esoteric set of traditions, including Zen Buddhism, to think about, yes, we are ourselves, but ourselves are something more than our uh, our minds. And how do you articulate that difference is where the variety sort of lay in some way, or the variety of perspectives lay. I think something similar is happening, and this is my intuition, sort of today, in which you actually have a technology that at least in principle is able to convince you very well that it is doing the same thing as you were doing. Uh, and it it does not do embodiment very well yet, and I do think that something like the uh, rollout of AI would uh, or should make people a little bit aware of the same conclusion that people in the 50s, 60s reached. That if we start thinking of ourselves, or if we start thinking of AI as basically replicating everything that we used to do prior to it, then the next question should be, then are we the thing that we thought is being replicated by AI, or are we something else?
Mm.
And I think that's a risk.
Mhm.
There's a risk here because I think people too easily, and this is when you are mentioning examples about AI as being lovers, AI as being like essentially your most private confidant in your life. Um, I think that's the wrong direction, wrong sense of selfhood, in which you actually start thinking that you are like your sense of self can be mirrored by something like AI. I think AI is great. I think it is hugely, hugely transformational. But I think what kinds of questions that you ask about yourself should change.
Mm.
And this is where I do think that something like uh, non-dual traditions, esoteric traditions,
Mm.
contemplative practice, psychedelics, advanced meditation, they all in some ways converge. Because I think if there is if there are two things that all of these things agree on, I think one is that in some ways you are not your most concrete instantiation of your personality in the world, or your thoughts in the world. I think that's one thing that you almost immediately sense in all these traditions, which is you are a little bit more than the role that you're acting out right now, which includes your thoughts, emotions, desires, preferences. And the second one is that uh, this realization should lead you to receiving the world in a way in which um, AI can just become a part of its furniture, as opposed to something that is really anxiety provoking. And you see this even in like some sort of recent like studies in like cross-cultural reception of AI, in which this sort of doom loop that you find in America is very American. You know, you don't see this, for example, in Japan or some like because they are very, very comfortable with the fact that the world consists of human-like beings. Uh, and we find a way of essentially living alongside them as opposed to having them immediately provoke a crisis of identity for us. And I think that's like there are different sort of I can see different future trajectories for how we reckon with this very, very central dilemma of our contemporary world.
Yes, indeed. Swayam Bagaria, thank you very much.
Thank you, William. This was a pleasure.